And running. Okay, so everyone can breathe this amazing sigh of spiritual uplift because we have left Egypt completely behind us, right? And we have reached Mount Sinai, and we have been told that we are going to be this nation of great people who will carry the spiritual legacy forward. And we all stood for the recitation of the Ten Commandments in Shul last week. It's amazing, right? We're free. And then we get Parashat Mishpatim. With all the rules. With all the rules. Apparently being free doesn't exactly mean just doing whatever you feel like. Apparently there are strings attached to freedom. Strings attached to this relationship with God. It's not just about being taken out of Egypt, it's being taken towards something even more important, if I may, than the land of Israel. And that's towards a particular model of life. And Parashat Mishpatim is going to give us a bucket load of rules that go along with trying to have that model of life. We're going to look at a few of them. We're going to look at the idea of them, and then we're going to try and figure out why we're doing them. So we're going to jump to chapter 23 in Parashat Mishpatim. That's on page 470. But it's chapter 23 if you're looking in a different copy of the Chumash. That's the first sentence.
Oh, yeah.
What's that? What was the question? Oh. Gotcha. All right. Will you?
I would like. You must not carry false rumors. You shall not join hands with the guilty to act as a malicious witness. You shall neither side with the mighty to do wrong. You shall not give perverse testimony in a dispute so as to pervert it in favor of the mighty, nor shall you show deference to a poor man in his dispute.
All right. So the whole collection here at the very beginning of this chapter is all about how we administer justice. That when there are going to be conflicts among us, which apparently, even though we are now carrying Torah, we're still going to make enough mistakes or have enough arguments that we're going to come up in front of a judge from time to time, that it needs to be done fairly. And when it says about false rumors here, this is really talking about falsifying information or false testimony that someone might give in a legal proceeding. Obviously, gossip and lies and all of that are also prohibited and also prohibited elsewhere. But this particular is when your lies and gossip reach the level of the courthouse. That is a especially egregious problem. It's one thing to say that you think your neighbor abuses his dog. It's another thing to swear before a judge that your neighbor abuses his dog and you've seen him do it 100 times. Because obviously once it reaches that level, there's going to be punishments attached to it that would not be fair if the neighbor had not been doing that. But beyond just the possibility of false testimony and lies, there's also a question of distorting our own judgment if you were sitting as a judge. That if somebody is mighty or powerful, you might be inclined to favor them. And you also might be inclined out of compassion and pity to favor somebody who's poor, even though in either case, the law may not be on their side. If a rich, powerful person runs a red light and hits into someone else's car, they should face the consequences of breaking that traffic law. And if somebody very, very poor runs a red light and smashes into someone's car, and they're not going to have the ability to, pay back the damages and all of that, you still have to say they broke the law and they have to face the consequences of what they did. In neither case do you say the law is other than what it is just because you have some reason, some emotion for wanting to be on the good side of whichever side of the case you think is more laudable, even if it's not more just. So it's a very, very strong standard and one that is often broken by people who are unwilling to listen to justice and instead do what they think is right, which often means muddying that water. But onward.
When you encounter your enemy's ox or ass wandering, you must take it back to him. When you see the ass of your enemy lying under its burden and would refrain from raising it, You must nevertheless raise it with him.
All right, so another little section right here where you have somebody that you are absolutely, at odds with. Let's be diplomatic, right?
Yes.
The hate is really the clearer word. They hate you, you hate them. Doesn't really matter, but you see them in a position of need. This is not your yielding to them in some legal battle. This is not letting them take advantage of you. This is you see somebody who's a fellow in trouble and you don't like them. And the Torah says, you got to help. Right? Now, this is, again, the exact opposite of what we just saw in the very first section. There's not always a perfect rhyme or reason to all of these laws fitting together in the way they are, because we sort of jump around. But these two do fit together very nicely. And in the first section, it was all about don't show favoritism to someone for one reason or another. And this is saying don't show disfavoritism to someone for one reason or another. So that if you see somebody who you want to help, of course you would want to help them, but you shouldn't if it breaks the law. And if you see someone you don't want to help, you should help them. Obviously, again, if it's not breaking the law, but helping somebody with their troublesome donkey is a perfectly reasonable thing to expect people to do. Difficult trying to go beyond what we want to do, isn't it? Right? But again, that's why the Torah had to be given rather than just intuitively came to all of us. Because we don't intuitively want to do differently than we feel like. We need this additional, and we're going to talk about, again, as I said, once we get into our commentaries, about why this would even be a good idea. Right? Why not just tell us to do what we already want to do? It's a lot easier, much more successful too. Right? That's the old joke. I've lowered my standards to the point where I already meet them. It's a happy life. All right, onward.
You shall not subvert the rights of your needy in their disputes. Keep far from a false charge. Do not bring death on those who are innocent and in the right, for I will not acquit the wrongdoer. Do not take bribes, but bribes blind the clear-sighted and upset the pleas of those who are in the right.
All right, so again, a sort of re-summary of making sure that we are doing what is right in all of our matters, whether we like the person or not.
You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, having yourselves been strangers in the land of Egypt.
All right. Like I said, we're only fresh out of Egypt, and this is going to become a refrain that we continue to repeat, one we continue to re-experience in the Seder, of having this, you were a stranger, you must also reach out to the stranger. But this is a very, very powerful lesson that has become one of the sort of linchpins of how Judaism calls upon us to treat people who otherwise would lack standing in most ancient societies. Even in the modern world, it can sometimes be unclear what standing a foreigner has in a country. But in the ancient world, it was very clear what standing a foreigner had in a different country, which was none. Right? You have no rights in most ancient law codes if you are a stranger coming into a country and you are not protected by some local interest. And Judaism is saying no. And it's giving us an emotional connection to say that not only is God asking you to do this, which you might believe would be reason enough to do it, but God is asking you also to understand it, to have empathy, to have sympathy, because you, of all people, should be able to have sympathy with a stranger who is out of his country, because you've been there and you know what that experience is like. So in addition to asking us for obedience, God is also asking us for sympathy, which is a whole nother level of commandedness. To command us to seek out an emotional state is a much higher test than just asking us to obey a physical action. Onward? Okay.
6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its yield, but in the 7th you shall let it rest and lie fallow. Let the needy among your people eat of it, and what they leave, let the wild beasts eat. You shall do the same with your vineyards and your olive groves.
All right, so again, a natural progression, if you look at it as such, as saying we were talking about taking care of the needy and the stranger being needy in almost all circumstances in the ancient world because they would not be part of the land allocation, and therefore they would be more dependent on others. And now we're given this additional information that once out of every 7 years, the land is going to be allowed to rest, but that land that's resting will be freely available to people other than you, right? That you will have to allow others, including animals, to come and just graze through your property. And that openness, I mean, it's, if we're in the modern, world, which has been driven by, the rights of the individual, it's just lunacy, right? Imagine you say you're going to open up your house once every 7 years, right? For 1 year out of every 7, anybody who wants to live in your house can live in your house. You have to leave. The doors are just, imagine the government comes around once every 7 years and takes all the hinges off all the doors in all the houses, right? And you get them back at the end of the year. And if an animal comes into your house, you can't shoo it out, right? It's everybody gets everything equally for this 1 year. A pretty radical notion. That wasn't going that far in the biblical time, right? It was not letting people have, possession of your property. It wasn't letting people come into your home, but it was saying that what grew wild, what grew naturally, simply by the gift of what God had put into the land, that was equal bounty for everybody that was around. This is also partly trying to answer our question of, if I'm not going to give favoritism to the poor in my legal proceedings, because that would distort justice, I should remember that I do need to give favoritism to the poor when I see them poor, when they are in need, that I do have to help them in a way that I wouldn't probably help somebody else who was already quite comfortable. I'm not going to give tzedakah to somebody that's already doing well. I'm going to support those that are in need. How we doing?
I'm good. I'm hesitating to do this, but can I digress just a little bit?
It's Torah study. Of course you can digress.
So what about the African migrants in Israel? What's going on there? And how do we square that
with a lot of...
Are they illegal immigrants?
Well...
No, they're not even immigrants.
Well, so...
When they went to Egypt, they were immigrants. The law says the first country you go to, you are immigrant or refugee. They went to Israel.
Yerach, was that in chapter 22?
Yeah.
Which law are you quoting? Right. So what Yerach is talking about, and what Michael had brought up, is the question of many African immigrants that had entered into Israel illegally. Yes, I have to remember the Torah doesn't know legal or illegal immigration. There was no such thing because there were no borders, there were no passports. A stranger was a stranger, and they had no legal standing until you granted it, which, as you can see, the Torah is. But the laws of refugees under international law, that is to say 20th century, 21st century modern law, states that somebody who is a refugee from a country of strife or trouble becomes a refugee when they leave their country of origin and enter another country's territory where they are secure. Right, so what Yerach is saying, and what many in the government of Israel argue, is that once the Africans enter Egypt, which is necessary between Africa and Israel, it's this sort of geography thing, that they now cease being refugees if they go to another country, because once in Egypt, they're safe from whatever ills they were originally fleeing from. Which ironically would mean that if somebody was uncomfortable in Egypt and fled across the border into Israel, by that standard, Israel would have to keep them as refugees. The various groups that the Egyptian government is cracking down on as terrorists, they could seek refugee status in the land of Israel because they are escaping the government of Egypt. That's why these laws are very slippery.
Well, wait a minute. What do you do with all of the refugees who were from Afghanistan, Syria, who went across Europe?
Yes.
What? They were still refugees when they got to Germany or France. I mean, they are. Well,
no, absolutely. There are many people in Europe who said, no, as soon as you step foot in Turkey, you stop. Well, actually, Greece was Turkey was the original dead zone. No, it's okay. They are very good questions, but the question becomes one of, at the moment, of modern politics more than anything else, because as you can see, biblical law doesn't make a distinction between refugees from war-torn or oppressive countries and refugees that are coming because they want food, they want jobs, they want opportunity. You may remember there was a group of 70 people, the earliest chain migration, with one guy who came into Egypt and set up himself well and then brought his whole 70 relatives down, and then they started taking over the country. There was, and they only came because of the food, right? They were not oppressed in Canaan. They were coming because economic conditions in Egypt were better. And as we just read, we're supposed to sort of remember that particular status. Now, does that mean that every country on earth is fit and able to absorb every possible immigrant for all reasons? No. But does that mean we as a global society need to have a better system of handling people around rather than you touch it, you own it? First border you've crossed, I don't have to worry about their suffering anymore. That is a rather short-sighted system. Now, Europe was trying to overcome that short-sightedness. And when they were reaching deals with Turkey regarding the refugees out of Syria, that was part of their moral philosophy, was that they felt that they should also help, even though they were not legally obligated under the laws of the international laws of refugee status. But yes, Torah does ask us to rethink much of our modern laws regarding immigration and refugee status. It doesn't give us a very clear, perfect answer of how we handle it now that we have easy travel for 8 billion people. But it does tell us that we need to think about it more than just, well, the UN made a statement, and that statement we're going to listen to, but the other statements that the UN makes, we're not going to listen to, which is not actually obedience to a law. If we were going to be obedient to international law, Israel would be in a very bad situation, because unfortunately international law under the UN, at least, because of the unique structure of how the UN is stacked against Israel, would have driven Israel out of existence decades ago. So we can't hide behind international law while also simultaneously rejecting international law. As we're going to see when we get into our question of why obey, there does need to be a little bit more consistency if we are truly accepting the law as the reason for our living and our behavior. And I don't think international law has ever been fully accepted by any country in the world except when it was convenient to the country. It's just one of the things of politics. It's, unless you have a world government that can impose the law on all the other countries, then you are always going to get countries complying only with the parts that they like, and then compromising where they have to by the coercion of neighbors.
You have a good example, the European Union. Germany, France, and Belgium, they accept anybody. Hungary and Poland said no.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah.
2 a day. That's what the Prime Minister of Hungary said.
Right.
2 a day. That's it.
Yes.
Oh, kiss my butt. You don't go away.
Yeah, unfortunately, they're also saying something very similar about Jews in both Hungary and Poland.
Yes.
So it's not exactly a good
That's
fit.
To one thing.
Yeah.
Israel has to think only about itself. We surrounded by enemies, and everybody that comes illegally into the country is a terrorist. Basically, potentially.
Correct. Everybody potentially is a criminal. Everybody who's born potentially is a criminal.
No, not everybody who's born.
Yes, they are.
Yes, they are.
I mean, it's not as simple as that. And as you can see, the Torah is not making it that simple for us, right? And that's the difficulty of there's a thing that we may want to do, and then there's what Torah has asked us to do. And the fact that sometimes what Torah asks us to do is not bad and sometimes even fun. I'm going to have a great night for my Seder, right? This is an amazing experience. It is something I look forward to every year. And sometimes what the Torah asks me to do, helping my enemy load up his donkey, is not what I'm going to want to do at all. I'm going to drive by saying, hey, and that's what I want to do. And the Torah is asking me to behave differently than I want. That is the challenge of Mishpatim, of this whole section of laws. And looking at the clock, we've only got a smattering here, but what we're going to do is just jump ahead here real quick to chapter 24, so we can get sort of the response of the people. Sorry, 476, it's chapter 24.
Then God said to Moses, come up to the Lord with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 elders of Israel, and bow low from afar. Moses alone shall come near the Lord, but the others shall not come near, nor shall the people come up with him. Moses went and repeated to the people all the commands of the Lord and all the rules, and all the people answered with one voice, saying, all the things the Lord has commanded we will do. Moses then wrote down all the commands of the Lord. Early in the morning, he set up an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. He designated some young men among the Israelites, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed bulls as offerings of well-being to the Lord.
Notice, by the way, we don't have the Kohanim in
Right.
place yet.
Right.
That's why we have other people offering sacrifices.
Moses took one part of the blood and put it in basins, and the other part of the blood he dashed against the altar. Then he took the record of the covenant and read it aloud to the people. And they said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will faithfully do. Moses took the blood and dashed it on the people and said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord now makes with you concerning all these commands.
All right, so pause real quick. If you look back in verse 7, right, at the very end of that verse sentence, verse 7, where the people are answering this command, the set of commandments, and this covenant that's being established here with the blood as part of this ceremony of binding us to the commandments. The people say, Kol asher diber Adonai na'aseh v'nishma, right, which this translation renders as being, and all that the Lord has spoken, we will faithfully do.
That's not right.
Well, translation is fun, right? So na'aseh, we will do. V'nishma, well, nishma comes from the same word as shomea, to hear, right? Lishmoa, like in the word shema from the Shema prayer that everybody I'm sure knows very well. It literally means to listen, but it can also mean to hearken to, meaning like the Old English word to hearken to, meaning to obey. So na'aseh v'nishma could be translated as being we will do and we will listen. It could also be translated as we will do and we will obey. And what this translation has done is try to say, let's emphasize the obedience side here. These are two synonyms that are being stacked for poetic purposes. And therefore, what it really means is we will really do them, right? We won't just kind of do them. We will really do them. We will faithfully obey. So that's how you get to this particular translation. But as you might guess, with that kind of poetry, it's open for interpretation, which is where we're going to start, but not where we're going to finish.
Oh, wow.
All right. Send a few each way. Okay, so our first commentary comes from Rashbam.
We will carry out what God has already said and are ready to listen, obey what he will command later.
All right, so why is there double verb, says Rashbam? The first verb handles everything we've gotten up to this point. Remember, we're still at the base of Mount Sinai. It's just shortly after the giving of the Torah. This is soon, and you can tell by the book, we've got a lot more material to cover. Not all the commandments have been given yet. That's the second verb. And that verb is saying, we are agreeing now to commandments as yet ungiven. We're agreeing now to commandments as yet ungiven? What kind of idiot signs that contract? Right? I mean, would you ever buy a car saying, you know, I agree to buy the car and we'll work out the price later? You do, it's laughable, right? You're gonna, but the contractor, he's gonna come work on my house and we'll figure out, you know, what we're making and how much we're gonna pay and how long it's gonna take. We'll take care of that later. Yeah, I mean, that's how most contractors seem to work, but that's not actually what you would want to do with a contract. How do we possibly accept that our people would have accepted this? Belief, right?
Have to believe in it.
Fear of God. After the last prayer shot, the thunder, the lightning, they said, we can't hear this.
All right, so we could have faith in sort of what I'm assuming you mean sort of in a positive sense, that God's been good to us, so therefore whatever God has to offer, we'll take it, right? It's like you subscribe to your favorite artist on YouTube because you know that whatever they're going to produce, you're going to want to see, right? Because they do good stuff. You know, I like that musician. I'm going to buy their new album before I've even heard it because you know that they do good stuff. So there's that faith in the past performance is an indicator of future performance. And then there's the awe, which is, I don't know whether I'm going to like it or not, but I do know I don't want to be on the wrong side of God because I saw what happened with the Egyptians. And yeah, sign me up for some whatever you got, God, because I'm happy with you. Please be happy with me. There is also that particular idea. There is also sort of a combination of this, which you could call love. Right? Did anyone here ever in their entire life get married? Do you realize you were making an open contract when you got married? Right? When you get married, did you actually work out the next 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years of life of who was going to be exactly responsible for what at every single point throughout the relationship until you both leave this world? No. When you get married, you basically are getting married on the assumption that it's going to work out. Right? It's going to work out. I'm not going to do anything to ruin the relationship because I would be afraid of that breach, of that break. And I'm also very confident that you will do good by me in this relationship because otherwise I wouldn't have agreed to get married to you in the first place. So I love you, and this is going to work out. So there are many different explanations of why you might sign an open-ended contract. And by the way, all of these have happened throughout history of other nations. When someone has to sign a treaty because there is a mighty empire sitting next door to them, usually that's all actually more fear of, fine, whatever you tell us is going to happen, we'll just have to live with because otherwise we won't be able to live. And then other, treaties and negotiations have been more just, America, the United Kingdom, we tend to get along pretty well. So we have more of an open alliance with each other for these things. And sometimes there's just such deep affection that it makes sense to make these arrangements. All right. But there are other explanations given for why it is that the Israelites were willing to jump on the mitzvah bandwagon and accept all of these obligations upon themselves. Because as you can see, they are accepting the obligations. These are not being imposed against their will. These are being greeted with enthusiastic support. And there are other explanations of why that might be the case in general, and which still should matter for us to this day.
So shall I read part from Exodus?
Yes, the reward and punishment paragraphs.
These are the commandments. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth.
This might sound familiar if you were listening to the 10 Commandments last week.
You shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned God.
Right, which is also often translated as jealous God.
Jealous.
But jealous has a different meaning throughout classical English than it does in modern English. So impassioned is probably a better modern English word. Right nowadays, jealous only means, the green-eyed monster jealousy of one person has more than me, or I'm jealous of him or her. Jealous can just mean impassioned, right? Full of emotional drive to get what is right. Right? Jealous does not have to be a negative thing, unless you're on the wrong side of it, in which case it feels awfully negative, but it isn't an inherently negative emotion.
I visit the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generations of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. Honor your father and your mother, that you may long endure on the land that the Lord your God is assigning to you.
So if you only had these few verses to go on, why might someone want to obey the commandments? What motivation would there be for obedience to the commandments?
Not to make God angry with
you. Because God could bring down the hammer, not only on me, but my kids, my grandkids, right? Or kick us out of the country if I'm mistreating my parents. So I think that for me, it's better not to get bad things, and vice versa. I'll give kindness to the 1,000th generation, right? There's also a reward that's here. There's a carrot and a stick that seems to be being offered in these few verses. And if that was all we had in the entire Torah or rabbinic literature, we might think the only reason to obey was reward and punishment. It's not. But for many people, it is still an important part of their mental arsenal of how they convince themselves to obey on a daily basis. For many people, they may wake up not exactly feeling like they are an enthusiastic participant in the world of Torah, but are trying to dodge the bullets of punishment and hoping that there might be at least a few rewards in the process. And for many people, that's the motivation they need to get out of bed. That's the motivation to take that first step, or to help their enemy's donkey, because they certainly aren't doing it for the enemy, and they're maybe not even buying into some other highfalutin ideas of what's so good about this, but they know that disobedience comes with punishment, and so they do it anyway. So depending upon where you are, this may be a very important thing to hold on to. Doesn't mean it has to be your only motivation, but it also doesn't, we also don't have to look at it as being a completely negative motivation, that, oh, you should never do that. No, sometimes it is necessary to think in carrot and stick terms to whack ourselves into the right direction. And this gets reinforced with Pirkei Avot.
And be as careful with a light commandment as with a grave one. For you did not know the reward for the fulfillment of the commandment.
Right? Apart from the ones we just mentioned, almost every other commandment does not come with a, and here's what you get, or, and here's what you'll suffer. It just says, do it, right? This is the circumstance. This is what you should do. And the payoff or penalty is almost never mentioned for any of the other commandments. So who are you to think that you can figure out which one is which is what Pirkei Avot goes on to say.
Also, reckon the loss that may be sustained through the fulfillment of the commandment against the reward accruing thereby, and gain that may be obtained through the committing of a transgression against the loss that may be entailed thereby.
Right? So you see your friend has left their wallet out, and there's $100 bills flopping out of the wallet, and you're thinking, I can get a quick $100, right? He'll never know. It's just sitting there. There's no way to prove it was me. Absolutely, I can get away with this scot-free. But when you take that 100, you don't know what your loss is going to be in the spiritual realm. And so how do you do the math? $100 versus what? And if you can't do the math, then you can't make a rational choice of whether it's worth it to steal the $100. And likewise, if you know that failing to do a commandment is going to give a penalty, but you don't know what that penalty is, it's of some unknown amount, then you know probably doing it is the safe bet. You know, probably doing what you're supposed to do is safer than not doing what you're not supposed to do, because I know there's a penalty. I just don't know how big. And yeah, it takes a little bit of extra energy, a little bit of extra time, a little bit of extra money to follow commandments. And I may not really know exactly what the benefit's going to be, but I know that it's negative if I don't. So because I'm dealing with hidden figures, you know, zero numbers that are hidden behind black boxes, like, you know, the whole let's make a deal thing. Is it door number 1 or door number 2? I'll take the given, which is doing it is not going to have a negative consequence. And therefore, it's the safer bet. Make sense? Right? Sometimes we have to trick ourselves into doing what's right or avoiding what's wrong.
And know before whom you toiled, and that your employer is faithful, for the Lord will pay you the reward of your labor.
Right. So, and we can also have a little bit of faith that eventually there will be proper compensation. So just because I've done a whole life of mitzvot, and yet I'm still not a millionaire, that doesn't mean I should think that God isn't going to make good on the promise of rewarding me for my good life. The reward is coming, perhaps not in physical, tangible millionaire style in this world, but definitely both in this world and the next. My life is going to be rewarded for the good I did, because my employer is faithful. All right. However, there are other times when doing the math, working out our moral life like an accountant, just trying to add up the columns and deciding that good is better than bad, lacks a certain power, and sometimes it lacks a certain joy, which is why there were other motivations.
Apparently this is under the category of love and awe, as you wrote it there. And Tigonus, a man of Sosho, received the oral tradition from Shimon the righteous. He used to say, do not be like servants who serve the master in the expectation of receiving a reward, But be like servants who serve the master without the expectation of receiving a reward, and let the fear of heaven be upon you.
Right, now, fear here is more a question of awe, right? It's not a question of like, trembling in front of a dinosaur fear. But the first half is, of course, the one that he's trying to make the biggest point, which is many people who try to do well, they do it because they are planning on cashing in their piety chips. Right, it's I've worked up, I've collected my bonus points for being a good boy, and then I can take them to the front desk, and then I can get any of the prizes that are under the glass counter because I've turned in my good points, my points for being a good boy. And while there is a certain truth to the idea that yes, doing good is rewarded, we also really look down on the person who is only counting their fulfillment of their commandments as trying to win the big doll at the end of the counter. There's a cheapening of the relationship between ourselves and God when we reduce our fulfillment of the commandments just to a mercantile exchange, a transactional relationship between my good for the good God is giving me. And that's sad. He's saying you need to look beyond that. You need to be serving God because you want to serve God, because you recognize in God. And that should be what is moving you towards wanting to follow these commandments, all of them.
Psalm 126, where the Psalms of Ascent talks about doing it with serving with joy, finding joy in the fact that you have the opportunity to do these acts of service.
Exactly.
And finding the joy is where the love is an expression of that love.
So as a good example, coming back to Valentine's Day, which isn't something that I celebrate, but I think it's a common cultural touchstone, so I use it as a metaphor. Valentine's Day, imagine two different ways of doing it. There is this person who brings a gift for their beloved on Valentine's Day, having carefully calculated exactly how much they're spending on the gift for the affection they are hoping to receive in return. Right, because they don't want to buy something that's too expensive, right? And they're not buying some $30,000 diamond necklace or a giant. Yeah, but exactly. One rose will get me a kiss. 2 roses will get me a hug, and you decide. Most of us, we're laughing, right? That would be callous and a shame for a person to treat their relationship that way. We would hope that if they were celebrating Valentine's Day, were giving a gift simply because they loved the other person and wanted to show that love by fulfilling this particular day's ritual of giving that gift, and not thinking about, and what am I going to get for this? And that is what Pirkei Avot here was trying to remind us, that when we are serving God, we should be serving our beloved. We shouldn't be serving our master who's giving out the paychecks and not trying to earn overtime pay by our goodness. We should instead simply be expressing the joy we have of being in that relationship, which is a very powerful motivator in many different circumstances. But it's not universal, and it's not something that most people always keep going. Again, going back to our metaphor of a loving relationship, you don't always feel like making breakfast in bed for your beloved. There are days when that's just not how you're feeling. It doesn't mean that you hate them, doesn't mean you want to leave them. It's just not today. Not today. Today, I am not going to be doing good things for this other person because I've got too much on my plate, I'm too busy, I'm too stressed, all the other things that can come up that diminish our willingness to serve out of love for the relationship, which is why it's good that there were other motivators.
God said, if you read my Torah, you do the world a kindness, for you help preserve my world. Since if it were not for the Torah, the world would again become, as it says in Genesis, without form and void.
All right, so just hold on to that radical notion there, right? That the entire world depends on the concept of Torah. That without Torah, without instruction, without this guidance for how the world should look, this image, if you will, of what the world ought to be, the world would essentially be chaos. It would just be swirling dust. Does that mean the world itself would unravel? Well, on a metaphysical level, yes. Right? The world would go back to being essentially meaningless speck hurtling through an infinite universe. With Torah, that meaningless speck becomes of absolute importance. Without Torah, it is simply a dirt ball. It doesn't matter how many things are living on it, it's still just a dirt ball. That's what they're trying to say here, is that there is something transformative just about the ideal of Torah that creates meaning in the world that it would otherwise lack.
It's kind of awesome to realize that concepts like mercy and justice and peace and, all of things that today we say those are universal.
No, not at all.
And we, as the Jewish people, through the Torah, introduced those huge concepts into the world.
Well, not only introduced them, which was radical enough, but said that's the reason there is a world.
Right.
That God didn't make the world just because he wanted something blue and green floating through space. That God made the world so that all the values of Torah would have a place to live. And if there's no Torah, then there's no point having this. It'd be like you buy a terrarium because you're going to put the turtle in it. If you don't have a turtle, there's no point keeping an empty terrarium in your bedroom, right? You don't keep an aquarium with no fish. You don't keep the dog house with no dog. You have this world for what is being put into it, and what God is saying that goes into it is the turtle of Torah, if you'll pardon the expression. Right? And without the turtle, what's the point? Right? What's the point? And which is going to be given more shape here in the rest of the Midrash.
The matter is like a king who had a precious stone, and he entrusted it to his friend and said to him, I pray you, pay attention to it and guard it, as it is fitting, for if you lose it, you cannot pay me its worth, and I have no other jewel like it, and so you would sin against yourself and against me. Therefore, do your duty by both of us and guard the jewel as is fitting. And so Moses said to the Israelites, if you keep the Torah, not only upon yourselves do you confer a benefit, but also upon God, as it is said in Deuteronomy, and it shall be a benefit for us.
All right, so the second half of that is a benefit for us, that we think of it as being good for society, good for our people, good for us individually. That's probably easy to get our head around, right? If you live a life of Torah, you, your community, and your society will be better off than if you were not living a life of Torah. That's a pretty easy calculation to make and a pretty easy thing to see in the world around us, right? When you have a society where people are not only selfish, only looking out for themselves, only caring about getting that success regardless of who they step on and regardless of what laws they break, when you have a society where people actually notice, oh, look, there's another human being here, and this person is in need and I can help them, or this person is in my way, but I shouldn't hurt them, that the society as a whole and the individual as a particular benefit from having that better set of circumstances. It's one of the reasons why, free Western nations generally do better and have higher standards of living and higher indexes of happiness than people who live in totalitarian dictatorships or in any anarchical settings where people are simply out for themselves and survival at dog-eat-dog level. We generally are better with the values and the style of life that the Torah is describing. Obviously, we believe in a few more particulars than just that broad stroke, but we can see the proof is in the pudding. But it's the other part of this that's a little more radical, that's also a benefit to God. Right? How do you benefit a perfect being? Right? God needs some help, right? God, what is it? God can't lift the other end of the sofa, and I'm going to help him, right? What is the benefit that we're giving to God by bringing Torah into the world?
Magnifying his attributes of justice, of mercy, of compassion in the world.
Right, because God can't be merciful in the world. We can. God has set up the world to be the world. The most beautiful idol we will ever create of God is a world that was created in God's image. But God couldn't do that on his own, or else, because it lacked free will, it would simply be the shape of the mountain. It wouldn't actually be the carved statue of testimony to what God is. So we are the witnesses of God. And God can't witness for himself. God can't be testimony of his own greatness, goodness, and everything else that God is. He needs us to make that declaration, because if people were going to listen to God without additional testimony, they would have already done it. They need the, user reviews, if you will, in order for God to be fully appreciated, understood, and to have the entire impact that God is looking for in this world.
Yeah, why the Torah says, I call the heavens and the earth to witness.
Right.
Yeah, this is the universe is involved in this whole thing, right? This is major stuff going on here. And so if you wake up and you're not really getting the whole reward and punishment thing for why you should be living the right life, not really getting the whole I love you today thing going on for today, and you think, however, all right, being kind to the stranger is making this world in the image of God. I may not be feeling it today. I may not be going for the whole reward today, but I can see that in the long term, what this does for the shape of the universe is what God wants to happen. All right, so I will motivate myself to actually obey that commandment, even though I'm not feeling it in any way on any other level. But you might be, because there are other motivations.
You are beautiful, my love. That's from Song of Songs. You are beautiful through the commandments, both positive and negative. Beautiful through loving deeds. Beautiful in your house.
That means the temple.
With the heave offerings
Mhm.
and the tithes. Beautiful in the field by keeping the commandments about gleaning the forgotten sheep and the second tithe. Beautiful in the laws about mixed seeds, fringes, first fruits, and the fourth year planting. Beautiful in the law of circumcision. Beautiful in prayer, in the reading of the Shema, in the law of the mezuzah and phylacteries, tefillin, in the law of the palm branch, the lulav, and the sitrog, the etrog. Beautiful too in repentance and in good works. Beautiful in this world and beautiful in the world to come.
All right, so taken from the Midrash on Shir HaShirim, on the Song of Songs. This is a little different, and I want to make sure we can get that distinction from the love emotion, right? There is such a thing to think that everything your beloved does is beautiful, but there's also a feeling that there is such a thing as true beauty. And the commandments are objectively, independently of our love for God, beautiful all by themselves. That when performed, there is an aesthetic and a harmonious feeling that comes from their execution, from their fulfillment, that resonates on through us, regardless of reward, regardless of awe, regardless of punishment, regardless of benefit to the society. It is the same way that a beautiful painting hanging in a museum can stir us, even though I know I'm not going to benefit from this. This isn't going to help my resume, and I know that this is not going to be because the artist and I are close friends, and so I have to say I like it. And it's not even necessarily going to make the world a better place just knowing that this painting is hanging here. Just being in the presence of this act, of this creation, is enough to make me appreciate and want to have it again. And so too for the commandments. There are moments of sublimity that come from the fulfillment of the commandments that are in and of themselves all the reason you need for the performance and the continued observance. On some days, right? Because on other days you're just not feeling it. Right? Some days you wake up and you open up that siddur, or you put on tefillin and a talit, or talit and the tefillin, and it's just, you are transported into a different realm, and it is all its own angel chorus singing for you. It's the most beautiful moment in and of itself. And other days you put them on and you're not exactly going through the motions, but it's, like making dinner for your family when you're not feeling the love. Or you're doing it because you know it's what your family needs. You're doing it because you know you'll feel better after having done it. You'll do it because you know that if you don't do it, that there's going to be horrible consequences. There are different days, different moods, different opportunities require different motivation. The thing to remember is that we have to find that motivation. We have to want that motivation to click in, and not be disappointed if we end up on a, in quote, lesser form of motivation. If we're not always in that beauty and love mode, or this whole world is being shaped by my good deed here mode. Sometimes we need a more base motivation. And sometimes we shouldn't settle for just a base motivation. We need to elevate us and seek a higher level so that we're not only ticking off the box and getting comfortable with doing it only for those reasons. It's hard and it's complicated because you never get to be perfectly at rest. You never come to a point where you're just doing it for always the perfect reason at the right way at the right moment. It's always a struggle to both find the motivation and then find the best motivation that you can at that time. And thank God, because that means that we are not on autopilot. All right. And then finally,
they rejected my rules and spurned my laws. Yet even then, when they are in the land of their enemies, I will not reject them or spurn them so as to destroy them, annulling my covenant with them.
So this is near the end of Leviticus, where God is laying out some of the things that will happen in the future. And most of them aren't pretty. And God is saying that even when all of this happens, I will not reject them, even when they are now scattered into the lands of their enemies.
All the good gifts that were given them were taken from them. And if it had not been for the book of the Torah that was left to them, they would not have differed at all from the nations of the world.
Right? So think what it's saying here is that, okay, God gave us the land of Israel, beautiful and wonderful and full of so much goodness. And then we ruined it through a whole host of reasons back in the days that Leviticus was foretelling. And so God kicked us out. If he had kicked us out and we had not still had the commandments, still had Torah, that would have been all she wrote. Right? That would have been the end. We would have become just like all the other nations of the world, which basically means we would have been anonymous. We would have simply bled into the nations and no longer have been a people, no longer have been us. We would, as a nation, have been dead. Individuals would have survived. The national identity would have been gone. The commandments is part of what binds us together as being a nation of Israel, as being the children of Israel. And that's something that has endured as a motivation for following the commandments, even when the other motivations don't kick in. Because I may not be doing it for my love of God today. I may not even be buying the whole reward and punishment thing today. I may not be feeling the sublimity, and I may not even be able to see how deciding between wearing something that's mixed of wool and linen or not is going to change the society for a better. But I do know when I wear something that is properly created as a Jewish garment should be, that I am making a statement about being part of the Jewish people. And you know what? On many days, that is reason enough for following the commandments, because I want my people to continue as my people. And part of that means doing what my people do. And the commandments is part of what we do. It's more than lox and bagels. It's more than just the cultural Judaism. The commandments is very much the glue that has bound us together as a nation across time and space. And on many days, that is reason enough to obey the commandments.
The word you're not using, but you seem to be expressing is hope. There's an element of hope with the covenant.
Well, with all of, yes, exactly. I mean, throughout all of these motivations.
No matter how bad things get, light will dawn. There will be something good.
Right. I mean, the ideal
requires a level of hope.
Right. I mean, the ideal would be in good times as well as bad, that a person is motivated and interested in the Torah. But especially in bad, we might think that a person would give up and the hope becomes more important. But it is also important to remember that when we're experiencing a good life, which quite frankly, I think 21st, we don't need more hope that there are good times around the corner. Not to say everything's perfect, but this right now is pretty much the best time to be alive as a Jew that there ever has been. Maybe excepting right at the foot of Mount Sinai, but given what they go through over the next 40 years, that's still debatable. We also have to remember that remaining distinct, remaining uniquely Jewish, and finding the unique gift that Judaism has to give to the world that comes through Torah, that our job isn't done, and our race has not been finished. We may have finished a particular leg and reached a point where we can take a little bit of a, you know, the little shacks they have along the marathon where you can get the water and the banana or whatever they do, right? The stuff that may be where we are standing right now in the 21st century, but there's still a road ahead. And the unique message of Judaism needs to keep being run in that race. Not just because of the reward and punishment, not just because of the love we feel for God, not just because of the benefit it brings to society, but because we want to stay as a family. We don't want to disappear as a people. And that means we'll be doing this book together. Good? Good. Do good.